Morning, everyone. My first time in Romania, so I'm very excited to be here. Although it's a little bit weird because when I first started working at NSA, this was a Soviet bloc country, technically the enemy. So it's a little weird for me to be here. But I've enjoyed my time so far, and I don't think we have any issues. That's all behind us. This is my contact information. Please feel to reach out to me. I don't know that I relate much to what's going on in Romania, but I'm certainly happy to chat with people, answer questions, give career life advice, hacking advice, whatever. Um, my company that I work for, they let me come out and do this kind of stuff, so I always like to give them a quick acknowledgement. I work for a company called Online Business Systems. They're actually based in Winnipeg, Canada. Um, and I'm part of a consulting practice there that does a lot of consulting advisory work, which is kind of what I've been doing for the last gazillion years. My background very quickly, 37 years in the business. Raise your hand if you were born 1982 or later. Most of you. Thank you that there's some older people in the group. A lot of my analogies and stories might be a little bit dated, so if you want to say okay boomer, that's fine. That's apparently trending these days. I cut my teeth within the DoD, within the government, primarily at NSA, and that's the crux of the talk today. This is more Tales from the Crypt Analyst. I gave a talk earlier, a couple years ago, that was Tales from the Crypt Analyst, that talked about the beginnings of my career at NSA, and then this is the sequel. This is the last tour of duty, which is what we care about. It's the hacking stuff. I do want to start by apologizing, because when I first put this presentation together and I was trying to find cool screenshots and images going back to kind of the very beginning of penetration testing, what we called it, or red teaming, I made this discovery. So I apologize. I tried to do as best as I could to find graphics that were relative to the time, but so bear with me. I'm also going to try to, as we go through the talk today, flash up some important dates in history. And this is meant to be audience participation, even though it's Friday morning and we're not all necessarily wide awake in ourselves, and we enjoyed too much partying last night. I want you guys to try to interact. So this is sort of a pop quiz, starting with this. Anybody know the significance of this date? Just raise your hand, shout it out. Anyone? Give up? Okay. So there's going to be that kind of scattered throughout the presentation. I've also included in this talk because in the last year or so, it's become more of a thing within the hacker community to try to raise awareness about mental health, because we've had too many family members that have had significant issues and sometimes taken extreme measures to try to ease their pain. So I tried to put throughout this talk a little reminder that no matter how passionate you are about what you do and how passionate you are about all the hacking things and the technology things, don't forget to have a life. So I'm going to smatter and bore you with family pictures throughout the talk, just to remind everyone that, while I was doing all this stuff, it was a day job. I also had a life, and I was doing things extracurricularly. My motivation, simply because of mental health, is things more like this. Anybody with me? All right. All right, so I was at NSA for 10 years, from 1986 to 1996. During that time, I was a cryptographer, and I actually, in those days, NSA had two sides, what we'll roughly call offense and defense. What most people know NSA for is the offense, collecting communications, traffic from all over the world, and figuring out what other people are saying, our enemies, our everybody. And the defensive side was protecting U.S., primarily the military, DoD, State Department communications. So offense, defense. I worked on both sides at various times and did these various things. As I said, my first talk, Tales from the Crypt, kind of talks about my first two tours of duty. In case you haven't seen that talk, I'll just provide a couple of the highlights. To to help give context to how I ended up becoming part of the red team at NSA. One of the first things I did at NSA was I was working for, at the time, what was called manual crypto systems shop. Paper, cipher, manual crypto systems, primarily things called one-time pads. One-time pads, if used correctly, which is you keep the pads safe, which is the key, and you keep both ends of it, because there's two of them. If you keep them safe, the encrypted message that you use with a one-time pad is not computationally breakable. It's unbreakable. So in my opinion, everything we've been doing since is just kind of downhill. We've sold out from perfect cryptography to, because of speed, and we want to do things fast and do things on the internet, we have to come up with all these different new algorithms and new ways to do cryptography, but they're all solvable. It might take 1 billion years, but they're all computationally solvable. So there's always a chance that somebody might be able to figure out an actual cryptographic attack. And to me, that's always been a big compromise, but that's just my opinion. One of my first jobs was working with one-time pads. I had a customer, let's say, approach me and say, hey, we're using these one-time pads, communicating with people that we are interested in having them collect information. That's my long way of saying spies. And while they have to use the one-time pad that's printed on the little 1-inch pad that they hide in the heel of their shoe, we back in the office that are the handlers, the managers, it takes us hours to do this encryption and decryption by hand, one letter at a time. But we've got this thing on our desk, this PC, which was very new, and an IBM PC. Isn't there some way we could do the algorithm, do the encryption, decryption on the computer? And I thought, yeah, that makes sense. What I didn't realize was that NSA at that time was responsible for all the cryptographic equipment that was used by the US, and it was all hardware. It was all little black boxes that got it added onto phones and radios and communication equipment. And the idea of doing something in software had never been done before. So to my best of my ability, what I did was simply take a one-time pad and put the key on a floppy disk instead of on a paper pad. So they were paired up, they matched, and wrote a program. I didn't write it, I was a project manager, but found somebody to write a simple program that would do the encryption and the decryption, a page at a time, securely delete the page, and move on. This had to go through an approval process. This had to be approved by sort of senior level management within what was the defensive side of the house, which was called infosec at the time. And I'm right out of college, young person in my 20s, if you can imagine. I can't barely remember it, but I'm standing up in front of all these senior managers, basically the board, and old guys in suits that were mostly engineers and mathematicians. But I was able to get this thing passed, and because I met all their criteria, and I actually had to sort of hack the rules because they were written for hardware and I was doing things in software. So got it done. I'll come back to that. Got it done. They said when they approved me, okay, we'll let you do this, we'll let you field it. Please don't do this again. One of the other things that I did I had another customer using one-time pads, and they used a particular one-time pad that uses a substitution table called a Visionaire square. That's the algorithm. It's a 3-letter combination, if you think row, column, and then find the matching thing. And they would memorize these 3-letter combinations. I, however, did not have them memorized. So at some point I came up with this idea of, because I'd just been through Crypto 101 classes, learning about cipher wheels, I thought there ought to be a way to make a cipher wheel out of this thing that's called a Visionaire table. So I came up with a Visionaire wheel. I have the prototype with me if anybody's interested in seeing it later. Been carrying this around for a long time. Earlier this year, somebody approached me and said, have you ever heard of a Diana crypto system that Special Forces used? And I looked, I Googled it and I saw this picture and I'm like, well, that sure looks a lot like my wheel, but we didn't call it the Diana crypto system. Long story short, I got in touch with the guy that's an artist that makes these things out of wood, and he sent me one of them. You can see that too later, find me out. But he was approached by somebody that was an instructor at one of the war colleges that was ex-special forces that wanted to preserve the history, because we ended up making like 15,000 of these wheels and just distributing it out to the U.S. Special Forces. And as far as I can tell, they used them for about 10 years. This is all stuff I did like the first 2 years that I was in NSA. He sent me a whole package of things. He does lots of wooden crypto puzzles. The thing in the middle is supposed to be the Enigma machine, the 3-rotor version. And I think the one on the bottom is like the Mexican Army cipher wheel. And I actually found a picture online of that's an actual copy of the production model. I'm on a hunt for somebody finding one of these things because I'd love to have an actual production one. All I have is the prototype. Anyway, I was doing all this stuff and I got cash awards. This is my old boss handing me an award for one of these projects. And he referred to me as a loose cannon. I don't think that he was being complimentary when he said that, but I kind of took that as a badge of honor because I figured out how to get stuff done. I thought that's the right thing to do. I'm satisfying my customer. I'm giving them what they need. So that's the first chapter. Second chapter, I moved on and became what was known as an intern, a cryptanalysis intern. And so I was doing 6-month tours in different offices, primarily over on the offensive side. And I happened to be over there during the first skirmish in the desert, which we called Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So I got commendation for that. Everybody at NSA did. That's what NSA looks like, by the way, at least part of it. And this is more for your benefit. There was an article that came out a couple of years ago in Wired magazine that talked about, well, before this article came out, there was an article that came out that said some CIA analyst, during his lunch break over years and years, had finally cracked the code of this statue that's in the courtyard of the CIA headquarters. And that's a picture of the statue there. The statue is called Cryptos. And so this article came out afterwards and said, oh, but NSA solved it years before this guy from CIA, and it had to do with a bunch of cryptanalysis interns. So I just wanted to say I was one of those interns. That's an actual copy of the computer printout of the cipher that we copied off the statue. You can notice the timestamp, Jason, and that's why I know what the CIA lobby looks like. And I was certified as a cryptanalysis intern. My final 6-month tour as an intern was back on the infosec side of the house, and I went to work for an organization called Fielded Systems Evaluations. And the purpose of this organization was to, somebody had the great idea that the way that NSA very often would intercept and read and solve the communications problems of our people that we were listening to was we would take advantage of the fact that those people using those systems very often misuse them. Like they would take a one-time key and use it for a month. When you do that, you're introducing cryptographic vulnerabilities that make the problem solvable. They would find bypasses in the machines. They wouldn't do the switches in the right order. They were basically not using them correctly. And somebody thought, well, NSA produces the best crypto in the world. We design it in our labs and we test it, and it's rated for whatever classification it needs. But how do we know that our people are using it correctly in the field? So this office was set up to do fielded systems evaluations. And shortly after I went to work in that organization, actually this is one of the devices that I was evaluating. This was like I said, it's a little black box that does the crypto. And it would take a phone signal, which was analog, digitize it, encrypt it, convert it back to the analog and send it out, and then one on the other end would reverse it, and you could hear what the person was saying, although they kind of sounded like Donald Duck. But here's one of those dates. Shortly after I went to work for that organization, this happened. Anybody know what's special about this date? I'm sorry? That's close. That was a few years early. Actually, I worked with Dr. Morris Sr. That's another story for another day. This is the day that our world changed. This is the day why we're all sitting here doing all this technology, internet, cybersecurity stuff these days. It's the day that the first commercially available free browser was released to the public. Anybody remember this browser? The few people that are as old as I am. Other things happened shortly thereafter, like cool Hollywood movies came out. And so those of us in the office that were devoted to what at the time was called network systems, we started looking into this thing called computer hacking. Our reference materials back in those days were books like these. My orientation, the book on the left, this was our Bible, because back in those days, all the workstations and all the networks were basically Unix systems. This was prior to Windows. And to know security meant you had to know how to secure Unix. And the networks were all written, everything was Unix. The book on the right was one of the early books written about some guys that were college professors that tracked down hackers that were breaking into the university mainframes where they worked. Here's one of those family shots. Shortly before I went to work in this last office, I got married, started having kids, and so I'm a dad. I was a dad back then early on. That's one of those mental health hacker things, reminders. So this small group of us in this office that were interested in networking systems, we were trying to learn everything about being hackers, computer security, network security, Unix security. And one of the things that, one of our motivations was a book that was written called The Cuckoo's Egg. Anybody familiar with this book, heard this book, read this book? If you haven't, I will cite several sources here that are recommended reading if for no other reason than historical purposes. So The Cuckoo's Egg is a book about, again, this guy that was like a college professor. I think he's an astronomer. And back in those days, to do work on the computer at the university, which was a mainframe, you had to pay for your time. And he basically was looking at his monthly bill one month and noticed a discrepancy in the billing. And he started investigating it, and one thing led to another, and he figured out that hackers from East Germany had broken into his university's computer, which was connected in those days to other university computers, which were mostly doing government, military, DoD type of research and work. And he was like the first forensics guy. He had to figure out how to track them down, and nobody had ever done it before. So this book was one of the inspirations for all of us trying to learn this hacker culture. I actually had the privilege of meeting Cliff Stahl earlier this year at another conference, so I got my picture taken with him. If you've ever seen, there's a movie about him that they did about the Cuckoo's Egg on a show called Nova, which is like a science show. If you ever get a chance to see it, you can find it on YouTube. He's as quirky in real life as he is in the show. He actually plays himself in the movie, but a genuinely great guy, one of my heroes and one of my early inspirations, and I had a chance to meet him this year. So anyway, when the government gets an idea, they like to do this thing called reorganization. So, the internet was becoming a thing, the browsers were out there, so the senior level management decided to reorganize and create a center of excellence that they called the Systems and Network Attack Center, or SNAC for short. And so the office that I was in got reorganized into this new center of excellence, and we actually went to work for an organization called C4, which we thought was kind of cool because, it's an explosive. And the idea of the whole organization was primarily to be a research organization to study all things in terms of operating systems and network protocols and figure out the best way to do everything so we could write recommendations. And then there was a small group that I was working with where we just wanted to break things. We just wanted to break into things and figure out how to find vulnerabilities and to use some of the modern vernacular to pwn. But we just called it rooting back then, because in those days the object was to get root on a box, and then you controlled everything. So we put together a team. We sort of organized, and we sort of had the blessing of senior level management, because he had this idea that, as he says here, that's more or less an exact quote, just get a bunch of those hacker guys together and we'll be the best in the world. Well, there was only about 6 or 8 of us, but we sort of took on the charge. And one of the things that we did to try to learn was we took a visit to this organization called the Air Force Information Warfare Center. Back in those days, the Air Force was responsible for the network for the military. So they had the first network operations center. And then they were the first ones to establish a security operations center. And that got reorganized into this thing called the Air Force Information Warfare Center. So we went down to learn, we went down to see it all in action, to see what they were doing. Our hosts were these two gentlemen we just called the captains. Gentleman on the left, Captain Waddell, he actually passed, I'm sorry, that's Captain Zeiss. He passed away about 2 years ago, unfortunately, but he was in the industry and did a lot of great things. Gentleman on the right, Captain Waddell, I actually got in touch with when I was putting this talk together. You know, we hadn't talked in 20, 25 years, but we had a good like hour and a half chat, just kind of, you know, catching up and, you know, sort of comparing our careers and where our paths had crossed and who we knew and things like that. But these were the guys that were setting up the original Security Operations Center, kind of the first one that was done within the DoD. They actually went on to form one of the first commercial companies in the whole security realm, a company called Wheel Group. They lasted all of about 11 months before they got acquired by a larger company called Cisco. Probably one of the first Cisco acquisitions of security companies. And I like to anybody work here from Cisco, I apologize. I like to razz on Cisco because they still have this identity crisis of trying to be known as a security company, but nobody thinks of them as a security company. So this center was in San Antonio. So we took a field trip to San Antonio. And one of the cool things we did was this was on an Air Force base, and they sort of had an Air Force museum, and we got to see one of these recently, at the time, declassified spy planes, the SR-71. We had just done Desert Storm, that's the A-10 Warthog. We got to see one of those up close and personal, and that kind of helped us win Desert Storm. Those are actually some of the original members of the red team there, and it's small enough, hopefully, that they're not identifiable. We got a chance to sightsee. We visited the Alamo, and there's this thing in San Antonio called the River Walk, because there's a river runs through the city. And very important in hacker culture, we discovered the 46-ounce margarita. And I recommend you only have one an evening, and that was more than enough. I was actually in San Antonio, and we had gone out to a steak place and had like a 26-ounce steak, followed by these 46-ounce margaritas. And later on, I back at the hotel, I called my wife to check on how the family's doing. And I was telling her about, oh, we had this great huge steak and we had this great big drink and it was all sorts of fun. And how's you and the family? And she's like, yeah, the 4 kids and I, we shared a can of tuna for dinner tonight because I was too tired to cook. I'm like, okay. So I made sure when I got home, I took my family on vacations. Again, mental health hackers. Work-life balance. The biggest takeaway from our trip to AFWIC was not that they had a lot to teach us, because they were doing a lot of the things that we already knew about and we were already doing, but they had an office structure that we thought was kind of cool. Back in those days, everybody had little cubicles, and a big open room would be filled up with, you know, however many cubicles it could hold, and everybody had like a little 6-foot by 8-foot space with walls around, and you were all isolated. They had pushed all the cubicles to the corners and the edges of the room and put a round table. That was the best thing I could come up with. Like I said, apologize for the graphics. But they had this concept where everybody would be doing their work, but if anybody had a problem where they wanted to ask questions or if they wanted to pull everybody together, they would call round table, and everybody would spin their chairs, come to the center of the room, where there was a literal round table, and they would have their little meeting and chat session and try to figure stuff out. So we adopted that. That was something that we did. In the center of our round table, one of us had brought home one of those 46-ounce margarita glasses that we nicknamed the Orb. And I think one of us still has it. I'm not sure which one of us. And we filled it up with like rubber balls, bouncy balls, and every once in a while, you know, just to blow off steam, we'd have like rubber ball battles in our office and try not to, you know, we'd just throw them and just see where they went and stuff like that. Because we were trying to live the hacker culture and we were trying to be different. We obviously needed our own space, and this is this office that we were in after we were reorganized into this thing called the Snack, was moved up to, and this is a photo of an area just west of an airport in the States that's called Baltimore Washington International Airport. So it's one of the airports that services Washington, D.C., the nation's capital. And just west of the airport is this office complex that it's not really a secret, but it's a lot of NSA buildings. And in this building, in this corner, is where we set up our office. I tell you this because a couple years ago, a book came out called Dark Territory. Anybody hear of this book? The Secret History of the Cyber War. In this book, chapter 4 is called Eligible Receiver. We'll get back to that later. And in that chapter, there's this paragraph I would like to read to you, just a portion of, somewhere in the middle there. During its most sensitive drills, the red team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed, and even they couldn't enter without first passing through 2 combination locked doors. Well, the Pit was actually this group of 6 guys that were in an office. I was one of them. And we had nicknamed our office the Pit, again, trying to sort of live hacker culture and be different and be cool and kind of nerdy. And so we had nicknamed our office. And we were very excited when this book came out. One of us got the book and took a picture of that paragraph and sent it around to all of us. Says, guys, we're famous, we're in a book. I have no idea how the folklore lived on, but apparently the thing that we did that we called the Pit became a thing and ended up in a book, which is why I'm up here talking today. So we were trying to become pen testers. We didn't call it red teaming at the time, and we were trying to learn how to break into things, and we realized we had to come up with a methodology. There were no SANS courses. There were no certifications back then. We were kind of winging it. We were trying to figure out. And there's a way that you do this that I think is logical and makes sense, and I don't think it's largely changed this day, but somebody had to write it down, and somebody had to figure out what it was. We did have some interesting ground rules, though, and I'll go into more detail on some of that. But basically, we had managers that didn't understand what we did, and so they were reticent to let us do our thing. And there was a lot of misunderstanding and sort of an aura of mystery about all these guys in this mysterious office doing these mysterious things. And whether you believe it or not, NSA as a large government organization is actually rather conservative in what it does. And so they don't like to do things new and different and move fast and quickly. And there was also this thing called the NSA Charter, which I'll go into a little bit more later, that basically prescribed sort of the ground rules of how NSA operated, which has come into question in the last couple of years with the Patriot Act and Edward Snowden and all that. Another story for another day. But basically NSA is supposed to do what NSA does to foreign nationals, and NSA is not allowed to do what NSA does to US citizens. That's the charter that we learned. And that was sort of problematic because we were trying to do the ethical hacking, the white hat, be the good guys and break in first and explain how it was done so they could close their holes up and be more secure. So as I said, we came up with an assessment methodology. We actually called it a vulnerability and a threat assessment. And basically, you figure out what you're going to target. We did what we called recon. I mean, we worked for a military organization. Our customers were mostly the military. So we kind of used the military jargon. So we'd figure out what our targets were, and then we would do some sort of initial discovery. What do we have to work with? Network probes, port scanning, things like that, to figure out what they were talking, what communications protocols they were using that we might be able to use to leverage. And then we would develop and plan, okay, this is how we're going to attack it. We'd break in, we'd win, we'd write up a report, we were done. So that was the methodology. To try to put this in perspective, and this is certainly not an exhaustive list, these are the kind of things that we didn't have back then. Exactly. Somebody gets it. You're my people. Another interruption for mental health hackers. I was always home for the holidays. One of the advantages of being a hacker at NSA was it was literally a 9-to-5 job, Monday through Friday. You couldn't take your work home with you. So I wasn't terribly disciplined. I was forced into having time off and not doing my job. So I showed you what we didn't have. Let me talk a little bit about what we did have, okay? And because we didn't have anything. You get it? You feel me? Okay. So here's a small disclaimer. One of the rules that we had to operate under was anytime that we were doing what we did to a target, which was ordinarily a computer or network that was classified, everything that we did had to be classified at the level of our target. So if we were going after a top secret network or a top secret computer or mainframe, everything we did was classified top secret. So I'm not going to show you the things that we were using, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. I'm going to show you things that were available at the time. You with me? That's my disclaimer. So we had these things called network sniffers. You have like what, Wireshark software today. Back in those days, the network sniffers weighed about 40, 50 pounds. They were these big, huge boxes. They were on carts. You'd wheel them around to wherever the network closet was, where the routers and switches were, and you had to like physically plug them in to do the network traffic. We did have available to us one of the first freeware vulnerability scanners, a tool called Satan. Has anybody ever used Satan? Yeah. This is a stroll down memory lane for some of those old timers. Also, sort of, meeting my heroes in the last year or so. The guys that wrote Satan, Vitsa Venema and Dan Farmer, it took us about 8 months, but we actually scheduled them to be on our show. I'm on our webcast podcast, by the way. And we got to interview these guys just about a year ago. Very special moment for me because I had met Dan Farmer 20 some odd years ago. And he wrote this tool called Satan. There was this other guy named Chris Klaus that wrote a tool called ISS. Dan Farmer and Vitsa, they put it out there for everybody to use for free because they wanted everybody to be more secure. This other guy that wrote ISS turned it into a company. They closed source it, and the guy became a multi-million/billionaire. I don't even know where he is today. But these guys didn't. These guys were sort of in it for the love of the craft, and they wanted to make things honestly better. So that was a special moment for me to get to interview them. If you get a chance, go listen to that episode. It's Paul's Security Weekly, episode 584. Oh, another date. Anyone?
Some of us were born by
then. Yay! My birthday. This thing called Bug Track came out. Anybody ever hear of Bug Track? Bug Track, if you haven't heard of it, and I also used to take the kids to the pool. That was a long time ago. Bug Track was one of the primary methods for people that were security professionals, hackers, whatever you wanted to call us back in the day, of finding out vulnerability information. It was a communications channel that was done over email, and it was an email archive. So if you posted a question like, I'm trying to configure this firewall and I don't know how to do it, people would respond to, well, what are you trying to do? And they would answer the question, this is what I'm trying to do. Oh, you need to do this. And it was primarily designed to, help people solve problems, fix bugs, and but it was also a great resource for information just in general. One of our primary sources. There's organizations like CERT, Computer Emergency Response Team, that would put out advisories of hacker activity because it was infrequent enough back in those days that they had the time to write up reports of, we're seeing stuff going on and you should know about it. I don't know if you can read any of that. I'll step over here. This is an actual CERT advisory that was issued on July 4th, 1996, and it's talking about the malware that we would call today that can penetrate evil aliens' operating system. If you've ever seen this movie, Independence Day, that's sort of how we won the battle. We hacked the mothership. So they had time to have a sense of humor back in those days. We did things called open source collection, what we call OSINT these days. We had FAQs that we could look up. We had very rudimentary database query searches because most of the information back in those days was just stored on mainframes that were all connected, and that was where all the data was. So they had all these different things. Also back in those days, every device on the network had an internet routable IP address, and it had to be registered, and it had to be part of a domain. There wasn't private addressing going on back then. So if you had a target, you could look up who owned it, what was the domain on things like the internet. Another search engine. We were talking about how there was no Google when we started out. We had this kick-ass search tool called Alta Vista. Anybody remember Alta Vista? Way better than Google. And of course, it's not here anymore. The browsers evolved, so Mosaic turned into Netscape Navigator. The original Yahoo, when that first came out, one of the fun things about the original Yahoo website was they had this sort of roulette button where you could just click on it and it would take you to a random website, because back in those days, they just wanted people to start being on the internet and using it and find out what was out there. So you could just go out there and play internet roulette. We would do things to find targets, as I said, acquisition. And if you notice, we didn't have Nmap. Before Nmap, we had this tool called Strobe. Trivia question. Does anybody know who wrote Strobe? Any idea? Julian Assange. When I was doing this talk and I was looking up when did all the tools come out, and so I looked up Strobe and I saw who wrote it, Julian Assange. I'm like, that's why I know the guy's name, because he's been in the news in the last couple of years, and I knew him, but I didn't know why. And when I saw Strobe, because when you would launch Strobe, again, it was a shell program. It would scroll up and say, this is Strobe, version whatever, written by Julian Assange. So every time you ran Strobe, you saw the guy's name. So there was other tools where you could do the domain lookups and try to find your targets. NS lookup was another way of identifying the names of the IP addresses. So some of the attacks that we would do would involve the names rather than IP addresses, or if we wanted to verify ownership and make sure we weren't going out of bounds of what we were looking at. And we even had network mapping back in those days, very rudimentary, but from a military perspective, back in those days where there was mainframes, there was servers that typically had the information that you wanted to go after. You could do some sort of traffic analysis, mapping all the IP addresses and finding out, who's all talking to what box, because that tended to be the target you wanted to go after. Another date, the public release of Crack. Anybody hear of Crack? It's a tool, not a other thing. Crack was one of the first password cracking tools. It became very popular. And again, it was written to try to improve the security. It was written for admins to say, let's look at all your password files of all your users and make sure they're using good passwords. Of course, we've solved the password problem. So this is ancient history. But back in those days, the passwords were hashed, and the hashes of the files were kept in a file called Etsy password, and it was world readable. So anybody on the network, anybody on any of the systems could look at that file and see all the hashes for all the accounts. And this is an actual copy of a file, not from my government days, shortly thereafter, but that's what the password files used to look like. And so those are actual hashes. Take a picture of it, type it in, run Crack, you'll probably get some passwords out of that. But that was one of the primary methods then of getting into systems was guessing passwords. In those days, it was new to put people onto the network, and not everybody wanted to even be on the computer or use the network. So very often there'd be lots of accounts on the system that they'd set up with an initial password, like, password, or not even have a password at all. And the accounts had never been accessed because the people didn't want to use them. People older than me, they're like, ooh, computers. One of the other ways that we broke in to systems very commonly in those days was taking advantage of what was called setuid. Setuid is a Unix feature that basically takes the ownership of the program, and the programs in Unix typically run in the profile of whoever wrote the program or owns the program, which very often was root. And if you could find one of these programs that were written to run as if they were root, and if you could cause them to hiccup or break or halt their process, very often they would dump you out into the shell that still had the characteristics of the ownership when it was running, which was root. So a way to get a root shell was to find one of these setuid programs and figure out a way to get it to break, which was not terribly hard in those days. So that's some of the tradecraft and some of the way that we did this back in the day. We went through some growing pains, and again, this is where the NSA charter comes into play. And we were working for a very conservative organization that wanted to move slowly. Another date. Anybody ever hear of PGP? Yay. PGP, for a little bit of history, was a publicly available encryption program that came out, as you can see, in 1991. The gentleman who wrote it, Phil Zimmerman, got into a lot of trouble because back in those days, any cryptographic product was labeled or considered to be munitions, and it had to be handled such, and meant it couldn't be exported outside of the United States. And so there was a lot of politicians trying to figure, and people within the DoD trying to figure out what to do with PGP, because NSA used to provide all the crypto, and now somebody's going and writing free crypto and just giving it away to anybody. Again, it's a problem we've solved. We don't have issues with that anymore. But I'll tell a quick little story about PGP. There was a day when in our Systems and Network Attack Center, an edict went out because one of our customers that was getting ready to spend millions and millions of dollars on new cryptographic equipment that NSA was designing and building, they had come back to NSA and said, why do we need to spend all this money? Couldn't we just use PGP? So this edict went out to say, we've got to find an attack against PGP. And this is actually me getting to meet Phil Zimmerman about a year ago. I've met all my heroes in the last year. It's really cool. But there are some guys, I'll take you so you don't have to stare at me twice. There are some guys in an office that was sort of next to us that figured out an attack against PGP, and they got all sorts of cash awards, and they were hailed as heroes, and they were taken down to the Pentagon and various other places in DC and all of the military facilities, and they were giving talks about, you know, how they'd come up with an attack against PGP and save the day so the NSA could continue in the business of producing crypto. Hailed as heroes. Months later, when sort of the dust settled down, they gave a brown bag lunch talk about what they had done. And I had never heard the details, so I went to it. So what they did essentially was this. See if this sounds familiar. They found in a word, we called it word processing back in those days, you know, things like Microsoft Word. I think back then it was WordStar. They found some unused byte space in a document, and they were able to insert some code within that document that if you sent that file, document in an email and got somebody to open it, the code would execute and basically steal the key rings from PGP. PGP has a secret in a public key ring where the keys are stored. You want the secret one, obviously. But this little routine that they crammed into like 80 bytes or something like that. It was, you know, it was a pretty efficient program. But they copied the key rings out and would send it out the next email. What do we call that? It's a phishing attack. That was probably 1995. So if you think phishing attacks are kind of a new thing, they're not. But as I was hearing them give this talk and explaining it all to them, I raised my hand at the Q&A and I said, well, wouldn't that work against our stuff? And they stopped and thought a minute and they said, yeah. So I was like, well, what's the big deal? And they're like, well, we weren't asked to try to break our stuff. We were asked to break PGP. So full disclosure, I don't know the answer to this, but I don't think NSA ever broke PGP, but I left there a long time ago. They found an attack against the implementation of PGP, and they exploited something surrounding PGP, which is kind of what you do in cryptography. Another story for another day. Me meeting Phil. All right, I'm going to give you, tradecraft, I'm going to give you one top secret. So, just between you and me, I'm going to share with you one of our primary attack tools. Are you ready? You laugh, but this was serious, because this is what we had to deal with. Hopefully you're familiar with the ping command. Is the system alive? Are you out there? Are you responding? It's a pretty common, one of the most common tools, at least back then in Unix or Linux now, just to see if things are up and running. Because the lawyers interpreted ping as what they called an active attack, and they called it an active attack because it elicited a response from the target. Because of that, before we could issue a ping command, we had to go through this bureaucratic process of getting permission to launch our attacks, which in government bureaucracy meant there was a lot of managers at a lot of different levels that had to sign off on it. And this was done on paper, and paper that was manually passed from secretary to secretary to secretary, and would sit there for a day or two before whoever had a chance to read it and sign it before it went to the next level. And I had to go up one chain and over and down another. 10, 12 signatures could take weeks. So imagine if before you executed something as simple as a ping command, you had to wait for weeks, if not a month, to get permission to do so. This wasn't working for us. So we tried to talk to the lawyers, and for some reason I sort of volunteered because I have a brother that's a lawyer, and I think I could speak their language. And the initial idea was the lawyers understood that they didn't want us to take so long to do all this stuff, but there had to be rules, there had to be sort of a basis standard operating procedure. Their idea was, well, just tell us all the attacks ahead of time that you do, and we'll sort of pre-approve them. So when you get a new request in, you can just kind of check off like an a la carte list. We're going to do a little of this and a few of those and a little of that. And we were trying to explain to them, well, that's not exactly how it is. This is more art form than science. You don't know what your attacks are until you start looking. Until you do the reconnaissance and the probing to see what you're up against, you don't know what your attacks are going to be. So we ended up saying, why don't we teach you about the methodologies and the process so that you become comfortable with what we're doing and sort of demystify it. Did I cover all that? Yep. So we decided that I would meet with the lawyers once a week, and there was a show on at the time that was popular called Home Improvement that had a show within the show called Tool Time. So we called our weekly meeting with the lawyers Tool Time. And we did that I primarily did that for a couple months, trying to educate them on what all this hacker stuff is. I also took field trips with the kids. So word got out. We were doing all this stuff. It was all classified networks within NSA at first and with other military customers, DoD classified networks. But somewhere along the line, and this is actually a screenshot of an article that came out shortly after I left NSA. But basically, we were approached one day by the Department of Justice that wanted us to do our thing to their internet presence. They had, back in those days, everybody had their own website, which was all there was on the internet, was a website, and it was running on a server that was hopefully in a DMZ, but it was basically part of the corporate network. And the problem was DOJ was an unclassified network, and NSA's charter meant that we could only, basically we were only allowed to work on classified networks. The organization that was supposed to do unclassified networks was the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. But it was well understood at those days that NIST didn't have the capability or the technology to do any of this stuff. So whenever they were approached, there was sort of this process to go through to get it back to NSA in the first place. So we embarked on this sort of months-long process of going through all the bureaucratic hoops to be able to actually go and do an assessment of the Department of Justice. And it had to start with basically cabinet level positions, asking other cabinet level positions within the government, hey, can you do us a favor and let the NSA guys come and do their thing? So this is a letter that came from the Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, asking the person that was responsible for what we would call today cybersecurity within the Department of Defense, hey, can you have NSA come and do their thing? And it took a while, but we were able to draft up a letter that had to come back from the director saying, yeah, we've signed up. So this is, I kept all this, just to preserve the evidence. But this assigned it. We were going to do the vulnerability and threat assessment. It had a cool code name. It's in there somewhere, Project Eagle or something like that. And you can see my name on there. I was the primary point of contact. Before we could get started, this happened. This was like the first breach of a DoD website, which was egregious back in those days because the military is not supposed to have imperfect or insecure systems. So this was big egg on the face because somebody defaced a website. They took Janet Reno, I'd scroll down, but it gets not suitable for younger people. They took Janet Reno's picture and replaced her with Adolf Hitler and things like that. So this big, huge problem. This had happened on like a Friday or Saturday. They figured it out on a Saturday. And back in those days, if you had your website compromised, you did what everybody would do. You'd pull the plug on it. And you just took it off the network. So I got a call on a Monday morning from the guy that I'd been working with at the DOJ to do all the, the point of contact, making all the arrangements. And he basically said, help, we've been hacked. Can you come down and help us? So I hung up with him and I got on the phone with the lawyers and I said, well, what, we've got the paperwork. We're like 99% of the way there. What do we have to do to just get down there and help them out with what was new at the time, still some sort of forensics exercise to try to figure out who had done it and how and all that kind of stuff. So they gave me a little bit of a criteria, basically get it in writing, get permission, make sure the permission is in writing, don't go of your own accord. So I assembled a team, people from the pit. We went down there. We were down there for a couple days when I got a phone call from the home office, somebody that was stayed behind in the pit, and they said, excuse me, Bia, the shit's hit the fan. You guys got to drop what you're doing. Come back now. So we did. We had to drive up from DC back to our office where we got paraded into the deputy director's conference room and proceeded to get read the Riot Act by the same lawyer that I've been meeting with and working with for months to try to come to understanding. And basically they said, you've broken the law. You've done something that could get the director fired, if not thrown in jail, because NSA doesn't do what NSA does to US citizens. Very blown out of proportion in my opinion, but went through all sorts of hassle, which again is another story for another day. But the long and the short of it was they tried to fire me, if not more, but anybody I talked to in internal security, they kind of said, well, you were just trying to help out. What's the big deal? The big deal was political at the end of the day. Again, another story for another day. The highlight was I got to be a part of one of the first SANS manuals on incident response. I think I was an editor, so my name's in there somewhere. It's probably in an archive somewhere. But eventually when sort of everything settled down, they took all of us that were in the pit back into that conference room and they said, we love what you guys do. We really want you to do it, but if you're going to do it here at NSA, you've got to do it by our rules. And so we said, okay, and most of us left. The 6 of us today, 2 of us are still at NSA doing God knows what. 4 of us are out in the private sector. 2 of us want to stay anonymous. The only other member of the pit that I'm allowed to say I have his permission to share, a gentleman named Ron Gula, who went on to be the founder of Tenable Network Security. You might know that company from Nessus. So, sort of an aftermath. We left right after all this thing happened. The breach happened in August. I was gone by the end of September. Another important date in history, and I'll just skip forward. That chapter 4 of that book that was titled Eligible Receiver. Eligible Receiver actually was the first joint coordinated hack of the DoD that was performed by NSA, by people that I had trained and people in the pit had trained, and they did it after we left. This is a picture of a round table of all the management suits, all the the really smart people that had dreamed up this idea. On the 20th anniversary, they got together for a symposium to talk about it. They actually released a redacted version of what had been like a 20-minute video that they did about the story, and it was down to about 8 minutes. And I got to see a lot of familiar faces. If you go to that website, I think it's still up there. The videos are there, but for some reason they're not searchable. But if you go there, you can find them. But don't think you can just Google eligible receiver and find the video. But basically, this coordinated attack was designed to take like 2 weeks. It was an exercise. People from NSA were going to try to break into as many different DoD systems as they could, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And they had to cut it off after like 2 or 3 days because they'd owned everything. And it started to get serious. and so they had to suspend operations. So a lot of lessons learned, a lot of egg on the face, exposing how insecure the DoD was, and so on and so forth. Everybody was insecure back in those days. I think this is the last date. Anyone? That's when Nmap came out, a year after I left NSA. We still get together every once in a while. One of the people that still works at NSA recently brought us some souvenirs. So if you ever make it to Maryland in the United States and get to Fort Meade, there's a cryptologic museum that has a gift shop, and you too can own NSA secret sauce. Or you can get the cool bat signal pen that's actually the NSA seal that's being projected by the pen. That's not a seal on the coffee cup. So you can get all sorts, T-shirts and mugs and all sorts of stuff. I recommend that you visit the National Cryptologic Museum. All the computers that I used to work on are now actually in the museum. It's really cool. Makes me feel old all the time. So I went on to private sector. I've been a consultant advisor for 20 some odd years. Still trying to fight the fight. I'm on a Paul Security Weekly podcast. I'm one of the hosts on that. If you've ever watched or listened to it, I bring up PCI a lot, the payment card industry, credit card security. I've done that for about 15 years. And I talk about it a lot, and they got fed up with me, or I don't know if they're punishing me or rewarding me, but we've just launched a new podcast called Security and Compliance Weekly that I get to be the host of, and I can talk PCI all day long, which I love to do. I love it and I hate it all at the same time. Hey, Jason, there's a picture of you on my slide deck. Jason and I are two cards in an educational fantasy card trading game called Freaker.life. That's a fundraiser for a nonprofit called Hack for Kids that's trying to teach young people hacking skills. And we got to be two of the face cards that they call anachronisms. I got to be in a book. You're in that book too, right? Jason and I are also in a book called Tribe of Hackers. Came out earlier this year. I think, well, they went commercial, so I don't know you can get the free download anymore. Also a fundraiser if you want to go out and buy a copy of the book if you haven't seen it. I'm actually in the second book. Are you in the second book? We're both in the second book. Are you going to be in the blue one? We'll see. Yeah, I think I'm done. So in a couple books, and I'm also a Jedi Master. I sometimes get stormtrooper escorts when I give talks. And a couple years ago, I was invited into a group called the Cabal of the Curmudgeons, which is basically a bunch of old timers that are kind of curmudgeonly and grumpy, but having completely given up hope in all of this, they meet and have dinner with a gentleman who's, I'll do my laser pointer. Whoa! I just turned it off. Laser pointer. Anyway, that guy right there, Gene Spafford, he was one of the authors of that Unix security book that I showed you back in the beginning. He's been in this business 50 some odd years and is really one of the architects of this thing that we call cybersecurity. So a bunch of these old people get together and meet with them. You have to be invited into this group, and somebody has to sponsor you. The woman next to me was sort of our den mother when we were at the pit. She was ex-NSA, and she was very instrumental in helping a lot of people out in careers. She was sort of behind the scenes, telling all the managers that didn't understand what we were doing, it's okay, let them do what they're doing. She sponsored me, and in an ironic twist of fate, the gentleman that I had my arm around in the red sweater, he's actually the lawyer that I used to work with. So we sort of, I hadn't talked to him in 20 years, but we got back together, and so now we're friends, and we just talk about the good old days when people were getting fired and stabbed in the back and things like that. And just to round it out, my family has grown up now. We married off our last child this summer. I've actually now moved on, and I'm a grandpa. I've got 3 grandkids, but everybody's healthy, happy, and the family's just getting old. I don't know if anybody has any questions that I can answer, but I'm happy to attempt questions. Thank you. There was a hand up over here. Mic person, couple hands. There.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
Can we share with us some information about Edward Snowden and the relationship between NSA and contractors?
Not enough time. Usually I say, take me to a bar, but I don't know where the nearest bar is. Find me out. I'll be around all day. I'm not, but
Thank you.
that's too
Thank you.
long a topic. Another person up here? If you ask a question, apparently you get a hat.
Hello, first of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Sure.
You talked a lot about one-time path.
Yes.
Do you believe that it will be still secure when we will get quantum one-time path?
As long as you're doing it on paper, it can't be broken. If you do it electronically, there's always a chance.
Okay, so what do you think? Will it be back or not, like it was?
I would love to see it come back. If you have information that you really want to keep secret, use a one-time path because it can't be broken. I mean, to me,
Okay.
it's a no-brainer.
But
But it's not practical in today's modern world.
That's what I'm talking about, because when we get quantum computers, if we get them, yeah,
Right.
we will be able to exchange the keys, yes, without problems.
Yeah, well, even with a one-time pad, the problem with most cryptographic systems is not people actually breaking the cryptography or the algorithm. It's the key management. It's the key distribution. I mean, there were some famous espionage cases that happened while I was at NSA, where people that were, spying for the Soviet Union were basically paid to steal the keys. So the easiest way to break crypto is steal the key, or somewhere in the communication on one end or the other, you're decrypting, or it hasn't been encrypted yet. So why go after the middle? Go after the endpoints. I mean, there's always going to be a way to get around it. Cryptography and encryption is good historically for communications. Long-term storage is an issue. But I'm not a mathematician, full disclosure. While the algorithms are getting better and better these days and longer, there's still key distribution problems. There's still ways around it. If you focus on the crypto, great. But the algorithms, although occasionally we find issues with them, not very often. And that was true when I was at NSA. We weren't very often attacking the crypto itself or the algorithms. We were taking advantage of misuse, bad security in terms of key distribution, key management.
Okay,
That's probably a secret. I'll probably get in trouble.
Thank
That
you
answer
very
your
much.
question? Yep,
One
right
last
behind you.
question.
One last question. Pass the mic.
Keep your hand up, keep your hand up. Somewhere around here.
Everybody's awake, man.
Thank you.
Yes.
Please stand so we can see you.
There you go.
Hi. I want to know, having worked at NSA, how synced with the current trends in technology are they? They are, I don't know, 10 years in front of us. They are, because this year, early this year, Jidra was released,
Right.
and have they had it for 10 years, or what's the process, if you know, at the NSA?
So, disclaimer, I left there 23 years ago, and I really didn't look back. So I don't in any way, shape, or form speak for NSA, and I don't really know that much more about it than what everybody else does in the news, other than when I'm reading the news in the media, I'm a little bit more aware of when it's, I hate to, fake news, or not completely accurate in terms of what they're reporting. I mean, even the book that I was showing you the chapter of, knew that we were called the Pit, but called the airport Friendship Airport. But it's been, and it was called Friendship Airport because it was built in Friendship, Maryland, but the name was changed to Baltimore Washington International Airport like back in the 70s. And I was there in the 90s. So mostly accurate, but not completely accurate. NSA, other disclaimer or qualifier, we were on the defensive side doing red teaming. I can't speak for what was being done on the operations on the offensive side in terms of computer hacking. Probably was going on there as well. It was a different mission. It was a different effort. And certainly that has proceeded, the outing of TAO the last couple of years. I know a couple guys that used to be in TAO. And when they meet me, they thank me for sort of laying the groundwork. Somebody had to get beat up for doing it the first time. And that was mostly us. NSA as a whole is struggling because the world has changed, communications have changed, the availability of cryptography has changed. And I see this a lot on our interviews on Security Weekly, where a lot of the discussion seems to be going back to older ways of doing things. Traffic analysis, signal analysis, emanations. We've had people on talking about, oh, you can exfiltrate data by using the blinky lights on the front of the server type of thing. That's not necessarily new ideas. So I don't know how to answer your question because I can't answer. I can neither confirm nor deny. That was our standard sound. Last question. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Yes, thank you, Jeff. This was absolutely amazing.